With Love, in French means L'amour, a Canadian thriller film that was directed by Marc Bizalone that was released 2018. This film is based on the 2006 murder spree of Stephen Marshall. In the film, the actor playing a character named Alex, a young man who travels to Maine under the pretext of visiting his father, is actually planning to use the sex offender registry to track down and murder sex offenders. Meanwhile, in the movie, his mother, Rose, has become aware of his plans, so she is traveling to Maine to try and stop him. But here's the real story. Stephen A. Marshall was born August 9, 1985, in Fort Worth, Texas, to parents Margaret and Ralph. In 1988, the family would move to Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, until 1993. Stephen would spend much of his childhood moving around. In the summer of 1993, Stephen would be sent to Arizona to live with his grandparents. His mother, Margaret, and his 6-week-old sister, Sarah, would soon follow and move to Arizona in the fall, while his father stayed in Lewisburg, Nova Scotia until 1996. This is when Ralph would move to Cul-de-Sac, Idaho, and divorce Margaret. Stephen would then move to Idaho in 1999 to live with his father, who was serving as mayor of Cul-de-Sac for the next 3 years, as well as the creative director of the Clearwater Economic Development Corporation. After getting settled in with his father a bit, 14-year-old Stephen would start a website in 2000. On this website, he would link other sites that showed weapons he referred to as the sweetest pics of weapons that you can find anywhere, and lists of his personal dislikes, such as minorities getting special treatment, men who don't keep their women in line, and the beautiful people, my job, cleaning, school, and society, just to name a few. The following year, in 2001, Stephen and a few friends would start a group called Slackers Coalition in Arms. It was said to have the purpose of giving advice for protecting yourself from the tyrannical education institution. This same year, Stephen's friends Chris Peterson Jr. would be arrested and charged with molesting a minor, receiving a sentence of counseling and probation. Shortly after that, on April 24, 2001, Stephen would be arrested and charged with felony aggravated assault after breaking up a fight in his front yard while holding an AR-15 in his hand. He ordered another kid to let his friend go. He was 15 at this time. In July, he would appear in a court and receive a sentence of 6 months probation, as well as orders to attend a hunter's safety class, write an apology letter, and write a 5-page paper on teen violence. As a part of Stephen's probation, he was to have a mental health evaluation. After the evaluation in August, James Phillips, PhD, stated, "Mr. Marshall's responses do suggest that he often somewhat questioning of authority and distrusting of the motivation of others. He is likely to be quite introspective and calculating in his actions." The report went on to say, no significant psychopathic is present that would have impact on Mr. Marshall's ability to comply with the conditions of his informal adjustment or contribute to the likelihood of his commitment of future crimes. The following year, on June 5, 2002, Chris Peterson Sr., the father of Stephen's friend Chris, would be arrested for sexually abusing 2 minors. He would later plead guilty to 2 counts of lewd conduct with a child and his sentence to 2 consecutive 15-year sentences, as well as pay $5,000 restitution for each count. In the fall of 2002, Stephen moved again, and this time to Phoenix, Arizona, to live with his half-sister and her family for his senior year of high school. In the spring of 2003, Stephen would find out another school friend, Chase Combs, was charged with sexual assault on a child. Chase would plead guilty to intimidating a witness and 3rd-degree assault. In September of 2003, he would move back to Nova Scotia with his mother and take computer classes and apply to Canadian military, only to be informed they cannot accept him due to his asthma, which would result in some depression for Stephen. He would go see a psychiatrist 2 times for his depression before canceling his next appointment in 2004. In the beginning of 2005, he decided to move into a rooming house. That then on April 9th, a convicted pedophile would move into the same rooming house as Stephen. So he decided to move again, and this time into an apartment in North Sydney. In January 2006, after a visit by his father the previous fall, friends noticed that Stephen didn't seem like himself, that his depression seemed to be getting worse. What they didn't know that Stephen was taking notes on registered sex offenders. He had information of 29 out of 34 offenders on the list at that time. On April 11, 2006, Stephen withdrew $500 from his Canadian account and $2,657 from his U.S. account. Early the following morning, on April 12th, Stephen tells his friends goodbye and says he's headed back to Badic, Cape Breton, but instead, Stephen heads to Maine, where his father is now living. And on the way to Maine, he has some car trouble and ends up at the Coastal Inn in Sackville, New Brunswick, for the night. He calls his friend Dan and tells him he is in Badic visiting his grandparents. The following day, his father, who has been expecting him, receives a call from Stephen asking him to come and pick him up and take him to his house in Holton, Maine. He spends the next few days at his father's residence. He's 20 years old at this time. Then, in the early morning hours of April 16, 2006, Stephen takes his father's truck, along with a Ruger handgun, a Colt 45 semi-automatic handgun, a .223 Colt Sporter semi-automatic assault-style rifle, his laptop, and heads out of Holton towards Milo, Maine, where Joseph Gray's home was. Joseph Gray had been convicted in Massachusetts in 1992 of raping a child as well as indecent assault and battery on a person under the age of 14. Stephen would shoot Joseph around 3 a.m. After this murder, he would drive by the homes of 4 other registered pedophiles in Maine before arriving at the home of William Elliott in Corinth, Maine. At approximately 8:15, Stephen would shoot and murder William. William's girlfriend witnessed the shooting and wrote down the license plate on the truck and called the police. William Elliott had been charged on March 20, 2002 of sexual abuse of a minor and convicted on June 12th. He was incarcerated for 4 months at the county jail before being released and listed as a pedophile. Stephen would ditch the truck near a bus station in Bangor, Maine. He then purchased a bus ticket and headed to Boston. This would be the beginning of a day-long manhunt in which Maine decided to temporarily take down the sex offender registry. When the bus arrives at 8 p.m., authorities are waiting for Stephen and surrounded the bus as they began to board the bus. But before he could be apprehended, Stephen would shoot himself in the head with a Colt 45. No one else was injured in the shooting. When paramedics arrived on the scene, they found the second handgun on Stephen. At 11:24, Stephen Marshall was pronounced dead at Boston Medical Center. Co-workers would say they were stunned to hear the news of what happened and described Stephen as a gentle soul who never harmed others. One of Stephen's teachers, Terry Crawford, said he remembered him as a youth to be emotional, a little angry. He went on to say he wasn't in bad trouble, but he was rebellious a little. He was sometimes a classroom discipline problem. He didn't remember him ever being threatening at school. Others would describe him as gentle and passive, but had aggressive tendencies in his past. Stephen's mother, Margaret Miles, said, "It's so simplistic to look at for the answer and just look at one thing. If we have a chance to look at this and we ever learn the truth, it could be a series of things. It could be a combination of things. It could be things we're not even aware of." In an interview cautioning people against making judgment based off of one event in the past. On April 19, 2006, investigators stated there was no indication of what drove Stephen Marshall to commit these murderous acts of vigilantism.